Hi, we're talking about Alexa skills and in particular intents. In this session, we'll take a closer look at intents. We'll start by defining what they are, how they work, and then start looking at how we can create and develop them. An intent represents an action that fulfills a user's spoken request. For example, a skill for pizza might define an intent named place order. When the user asks Domino's to order a pizza, it's the intent that actually takes the user's spoken request and does something actionable like place that order, which really means communicate with the back end or linked accounts and then to begin fulfilling a specific request. When it comes to developing or creating intents, there are two categories of intents that you can define. The first is custom intents, and the second is what's known as built-in intents. First, let's take a look at custom intents in further detail. When you create a new custom intent, you essentially define the name and a list of utterances that users express with voice interactions to invoke this intent. The idea is that you want to consider all of the different possibilities as much as possible that they may try to communicate with your skill. When you're designing your custom intent, Amazon recommends that you begin by writing all sorts of phrases that may correspond to essentially interacting with that skill. So if you take a look at, I would like to send an email and I want to use Gmail, essentially these two things would be accomplishing overall the same goal, that is to send an email. So you want to start thinking about all the different types of ways that you could do this. And again, one of the easiest ways is to write down all the different types of phrases. It also helps if you have somebody that you can converse with and actually talk about it and essentially ask them the question and see how they would respond to you. When it comes to developing custom intents, there are some considerations that you should be aware of, specifically with name requirements. So the name of an intent can only contain case-insensitive alphabetical characters and underscores. So in this slide on the left-hand side, you can see these are valid intent names. Notice create Gmail, send email, and reply email. So I can use a lowercase r, I can use uppercase letters, that's all fine. On the right-hand side, on the other hand, these would be considered invalid intent names. Notice in the first one, I have a space between create and Gmail. In the second, I actually have a number in there, the number 3. And in the third, I'm using a hyphen between both words. So no numbers, spaces, or special characters are allowed. Intent names cannot overlap with any slot name in the schema. So in other words, you can't have the name of the intent as well as any specific slots, which we're going to get to later, have the exact identical name. If that happens, then you're going to run into a conflict. So I use the term special characters, and you might not be familiar with what that is, or even if you are familiar, you might not know specifically what special characters it could be referring to since there's so many. So what I've gone ahead and done is in this slide, I've depicted that information for you. So if you're unfamiliar with what a special character is, simply ask yourself the question, is it a symbol? And if the answer is yes, then most likely it's considered a special character. Here are some common special character examples. So you can see exclamation, comma, the @ symbol, hash, $, percent, all of these types of characters, mathematical operators, all of those types of things, question marks, periods, all that kind of information, those would all be considered special characters. There's a complete list of ASCII characters listed in the third bullet point, and you can click on that link and basically get an idea of all the special characters there are out there. The Alexa Skill Kit provides a library of built-in intents. This was our other category of types of intents that we can define and develop and work with, specifically work with. You can use these intents to add functionality to your skill without providing any sample utterances. Note that the built-in intents use the Amazon namespace, so they are specified using a period like this, Amazon.help_intent. This notation is only valid for specifying the Amazon namespace. Periods should not be used in other intent names. Okay, so you're probably like, I don't understand. You just said that you can't use periods and you're using periods. Well, this is the exception. If you are using a built-in intent, that is an intent developed by Amazon, you use a period in this case. There are a number of different built-in intent categories that you can develop, and some are in developer preview. So For example, books, calendar, cinema showtimes, general, local search, music, video, and weather. All of these are different types of built-in skills that you can essentially develop on top of and essentially use that functionality that is provided to you by Amazon. So you might be asking yourself, why would I use a built-in intent? Well, the Alexa Skill Kit includes a large library of built-in intents you can use instead of creating your own. This actually simplifies development because of a lot of the nuances have been abstracted away from your custom logic. When creating a new intent, select the built-in intent, and we're going to cover more on that later. We've talked a lot about intents, but what do they look like? Well, an intent is written as a JSON complex type, which represents a key value pair. Here's a very basic example. Here you can see we essentially are following a key value pair implementation. We have a starting curly brace here and a closing one here, and then we have a complex type we're defined. Here, this is interaction model. Notice that it's in double quotation marks, and then we have a colon here and an opening curly brace as well as a closing one down here. With inside that, we have a nested key value pair, which is a language model, which is also in quotation marks and also has a colon and an open and closing parenthesis. Here, this is our intent object, is another key value pair, but notice the difference here. We're specifying a plural here, a plural noun, intents with an S. So what we're essentially doing is we're defining a key, colon, but we're also defining a list here. Notice that this is a bracket instead of this curly brace here, and this is where we can specify more than one specific type of intent. When you're writing code or developing code, you tend to have to follow the syntax associated with developing in that specific language or in that specific platform. In this case, you'll often use the term syntax. Recall that we said that JSON follows a key value pair system. As you might imagine, for us to develop an intent here, we need to actually define what that intent would look like. So how would we do that? Well, essentially, it's exactly the same process. For us to specify a specific intent that we wish to create, we'll need to use an open and closing curly bracket. Once we've defined that, then we can actually define what the complex type would look like. We need to conform to a specific schema, in this case, Alexa's schema. So, particularly here, we're defining the name of an intent called create Gmail and the type. So there we have a custom intent label. That's going to be used later when we start developing further into our actual intent logic. In the last example, you'll notice that we actually were defining and developing a custom intent. Well, what happens if we were going to use a built-in intent? Essentially, we follow the same process. The only difference is here, we're going to actually use an Amazon namespace to specify our specific type. So this is what a built-in in type looks like, the difference. Notice that in the other example, we had a custom label, but in this one, we have that Amazon namespace, which is our clue and indication that this is going to be a built-in type. So that concludes this section on the intents and our intent deep dive. In the next section, we're going to start getting more and more into the syntax and start developing some of this stuff.